Chapter 8 Redstone. Vimalananda's interest in his spiritual children had been corroding for some time, for they were proving to be no more dedicated than Shankaracharya's sons. It waned yet further on the morning that he had a visitation from Doshi's wife. She and Doshi had come to Pune that weekend to accompany us for some homa nearby, and were staying in the hotel room that was next door to Vimalananda's. Apparently these two, conniving, perhaps with some of the other children, had decided that it was time for Vimalananda to part with some of his tantric sexual knowledge. Mrs. Doshi had therefore knocked on Vimalananda's door, braless, her sari barely covering her sagging, middle-aged bosoms, to beseech this expert for a Vajroli practitioner, or at the very least a how-to course in Lata Mudra. It was very difficult for me to see how the evidently dissolute Mrs. Doshi could have any chance to succeed at Lata Mudra, a practice in which two sexual partners invoke Lord Shiva and his grand consort Parvati into their bodies before their dally together. How could she even dream of Vajroli, in which you use your genitals to suck up your partner's secretions during intercourse? As I remembered Vimalananda's often repeated advice, just slow down and refinement occurs automatically, especially in sex, it became obvious that the contrapositive must be equally true. Just speed up and coarseness will overtake you, especially in sex. I was raking my brain for some worthy comment to offer my offended mentor when Vimalananda spat out, "Who does she think she is? Does she think I'll see her naked boobs and lose control? I've seen much better than hers, and I'm still in control." Calming him down with sweet words being now quite out of the question, I decided to try discharge the rest of his repugnance at her wasteful haste by first intensifying it. "Maybe," I said, "she thinks she's become some great Bhairavi," a Bhairavi being the female in a Lata Mudra partnership, to which he replied, "Bhairavi my foot! Can you be a Bhairavi if you are completely lacking in niyama? To succeed at any sort of sadhana, you first have to learn to say no to the things that are preventing you from making progress. Roshni has been able to make some progress in her sadhana because she's learned the 3 stages of no." "The 3 stages of no?" "Yes. The first stage is N-O, no. No. If that doesn't work, move up to G-O, go. Go! Get lost! That will usually work, but if it doesn't, then you have to get tough, and you say F-O. F-O is bound to do the trick." The Doshi incident multiplied Vimalananda's ire with my recently inaugurated semi-romantic liaison with one of my fellow Ayurvedic students. He was unhappy that I spent time with this girl that I could have spent meditating or studying instead. He was concerned that some indiscretion of ours might be seized upon by my enemies at the college and used to attack me. He was wary of having the girl's reputation ruined, particularly if we became physically intimate, which she and I both realized would be highly unwise. He did not care much for the girl herself. It was in this rather vitiated climate that not long after the Balam Bhat Faram Shankaracharya discourse, he sat me down and said to me, "Your Sade Sati is about to begin." His tone of voice alarmed me, though the words themselves were not overly sinister. Sade Sati means 7.5 in Hindi. I tried to sound plucky. "The 7.5? "Yes, the Sade Sati is 7.5-year period during which Saturn will afflict the moon in your horoscope." This was sounding less and less pleasant. "In Jyotish we respect the sun as the planet of light, but we regard its effects as harsh. Its light burns you. The moon's light, however, cools and nourishes you, which makes the moon the most important planet in Jyotish after Saturn. When Saturn, the planet of dryness, constriction, and disappointment, transits the moon, it pinches off the flow of life's juices and promotes desolation. Not a very attractive prospect. I tried to keep my gorge from rising. "How is Saturn," I asked slowly, to throttle down my racing mind, "going to affect me?" "It will affect you in the same way that all the other planets affect you, by its subtle gravity. The planets you see in the sky are gross, physical structures that have a minor effect on us. But each of these gross planets is the physical reflection of a subtle planet whose gravity affects us strongly. Saturn's subtle gravity spares no one, not his fellow planets, not his fellow devas, not even his father, the sun. Even the rishis are affected. By nourishing the sun, the rishis are able to direct the influence of the sun on themselves and on the world in general. One of the many benefits they gain thereby is some control over Saturn. But only some, for even they sometimes fall under Saturn's shadow. As long as they exist on the earth, even the rishis have to be concerned about Saturn. Think of Parashahara. Even he did not escape, in spite of being an expert in astrology." "Great! So now I'm finished. What is going to happen to me? Should I make out my will?" "No, but I may need to. One of the main effects of the Sade Sati is Chatrabhanga." "The breaking of the umbrella?" "Exactly. An umbrella is a very useful thing, right? It keeps the sun and rain off your head. It protects you from the elements, from the outside world. The parents and grandparents of a small child form its umbrella. Sade Sati tends to cause those relatives to be broken, to disappear from the scene somehow." "By dying, for example?" "Yes, or going to jail, being kidnapped, or simply running away. Roshni's Sade Sati begins when yours does, because her moon occupies the same constellation that yours does. You and Roshni both treat me as a father, which makes me doubt that the effect on me is going to be very good. Your parents and Roshni's mother will probably also be affected." Prescient words these. Vimalananda died midway through this Sade Sati. My mother came very close to death a few months thereafter, and a few months after that, Roshni's mother died, well before the period ended for the two of us. Is there anything at all good about the Sade Sati? Well, the best time for you to perform any sadhana is when Saturn turns his gaze on you, when the influence of Saturn predominates in your horoscope. If you cooperate, Saturn can make you experience great spiritual heights. You should always respect Saturn, but never be afraid of him. Orthodox people are afraid of Saturn. They treat him like the devil incarnate. But if they really are so pure, why should they be worried about Saturn? What should I do? One approach to problem planets is to wear gems and perform rituals to placate them. Another approach is to have full faith in your deity and request him or her to take care of everything. I prefer the latter approach, except that when it comes to Saturn, you really have to have absolute faith in your personal deity if you want to be protected. If your faith is not total, Saturn will still be able to affect you. You may therefore want to diminish Saturn's effects, not eliminate them, which is not possible, but at least reduce them. To do this, you can either worship Saturn or you can worship Shiva, especially in his incarnation as Anjanya. Look at that photo of Anjanya there on the wall. Do you see the mace he holds on her shoulder? Yes, I replied with unnecessary peevishness. I have told you before that Anjanya's mace controls all the planets except Saturn, who is controlled by his tail. But what does that mean? Hanuman's mace is the name of a mudra, a hand gesture which is nothing but part of nyasa. Nyasa is a way to place the deity you are worshipping into your subtle body so that your deity can pervade your being. A sadhaka makes his internal temple sacred by means of nyasa so that his beloved deity will find it inviting to enter him. When you can properly perform Hanuman's mace and you use it with the appropriate mantra, Anjanya can enter you. Then he can do the work of controlling the planets instead of you. Until you have realized Hanuman in yourself, this mudra will give only minor results. Once Anjanya performs that mudra through you, the control will be perfect. I have not yet realized Anjanya in myself, I said with real contrition. I will continue to worship Anjanya, but the results I will obtain are bound to continue to be limited. Is there anything I can do in addition? Yes, there is. You should read the Shani Mahatmya, meaning the greatness of Saturn. That will help you too. Impressed by Vimalananda's seriousness, I went out straight away to get myself a copy of The Greatness of Saturn and began to read it. As if by way of reinforcement, nature confirming the righteousness of this act, Saturn popped up for me on my very next trip to the racetrack. You see that old fellow over there in the Maharashtrian dhoti, vest and a hat? Said Vimalananda, pointing downwards between races. That is Deshpande from Pune. One year he bought a foal that had something wrong with its palate. Whenever it tried to eat, it would regurgitate some of its food. Every vet who inspected it said it was incurable without a complicated operation. All of us, including me, thought Deshpande was a fool for wasting his money on it. But he knows some Ayurveda and worked wonders on that horse. I tell you, wonders. He named it Akhlaq, and it won races for him. Akhlaq, I said loudly. That's the name of the horse from The Greatness of Saturn, the one that carried King Vikramaditya away into the sky when he sat down on its back. Very good. Now why Deshpande would name his horse Akhlaq is completely beyond me, unless he thought that somehow that name was going to make it fly down the track. Maybe he thought it would make Saturn happy. Maybe. If only it were so easy to satisfy Saturn. Saturn was still much on my mind as I prepared, at Vimalananda's behest, to leave for the United States and begin to lecture on Ayurveda. He had already forced me to write one little book, which Dr. Martanda had volunteered to publish. He had also arranged for a dinner meeting in Pune to introduce me to various newspaper reporters who reciprocated for the good food and copious drink they were served by dutifully writing glowing accounts of my genius. I had no desire to leave Vimalananda and go to work in the West, but he kept reminding me of the runas to my parents and my homeland, which remained outstanding. Runas which I would do better to pay off now rather than later. And besides, he would say, think how happy it will make your parents feel for you to make a success of yourself. Don't you think they must be worried about whether or not you'll be properly set up in life before they die? Don't you want to take that load off their minds? One day, when he was going on in this vein, I interrupted him with, "But I'm going to a country filled with asuras, where the food will be totally impregnated with commercial gravity. I'm no saint. How am I ever going to save myself from being ruined?" "Don't worry, my boy," he said compassionately. "I will always be there with you. Whenever you are troubled, remember Anjanya. With Anjanya's help, you will never get bogged down in the quicksand." Then he added, as if in afterthought, "If only all those monkeys over in America would worship Anjanya, they might save themselves from being stuck also." He had compared Westerners to monkeys before, but I took this reference to heart and testily asked him, "Aren't the people in India monkeys too?" "I know what I am saying," he said serenely. "Listen now to why I say it. Though Ramachandra, the seventh of Vishnu's avatars, has long since left earth, his dedicated devotee, the immortal Anjanya, remains, and so do the blessings that Lord Rama gave while he walked on earth, blessings whose effects can be felt even today. I take my mind back to the Dvapara Yuga, perhaps 1,000,000 years ago, when Rama made 3 promises. The first was to Jatayu, the eagle who tried to rescue Sita from Ravana without even knowing who she was. Rama promised Jatayu that in Kali Yuga he would be worshipped and adored as perfectly humane, even though a bird. By temperament, eagles are killers, but Lord Rama gave Jatayu the powers of sympathy and compassion to shelter all under his wings. Rama even took Jatayu's head in his lap when the old bird died, which is something he did not even do for his own father, Dasharatha. Whose symbol is the eagle? America's. America is the first country to help anywhere in the world in time of famine, flood, or other disaster. Americans are generous by nature and love to give to others who don't have enough, and they do it just for the sake of doing it, not for gain, because it is to be done, just as Jatayu did for Sita. Some say that in Kali Yuga, the giving of gifts is the highest form of religious merit. As Americans have given a great deal, they have collected considerable spiritual benefits. Yes, they have also made mistakes, like Vietnam, but they have still done more good than anyone else has. So America is Lord Rama's blessing to this earth through the eagle Jatayu. Rama's second promise was to the monkeys who built the bridge to Lanka. They were blessed that in Kali Yuga they would become great inventors and innovators and would rule the world. This also refers to America. The Americans are ruling the world and are responsible for most of the great inventions that have so radically changed the world. I call your fellow countrymen monkeys because they are descended from monkeys. Even they believe that they are descended from monkeys. But now they have forgotten their ancestry and are experimenting on monkeys. The curses they are receiving from their monkey brethren are rapidly eroding this blessing that Lord Rama gave them. The third promise was to Sita, that women will come forward in Kali Yuga. And America is the leader in making women the absolute equals of men. This is why I say that America has been triply blessed. I am so fond of America because of these blessings, not because of its riches or power, neither of which will last forever. They may not last much longer, in fact, because America is wasting both its riches and its power at a very high rate of speed. Still, Americans have Rama's 3 blessings, and also blessings from Ramakrishna Paramahasa and Swami Vivekananda. So they will continue to thrive for a while. Now, was no one else blessed by Lord Rama? Well, Russia was. Otherwise, how could it ever have become a superpower? Russia's symbol is the bear. The bear Jambavant did help Lord Rama in his quest for Sita, but not as much as the monkeys did. This means that Russia will never have ascendancy over America. Thank God for that. I hate communism. Another reason that America is strong can be discovered in numerology. How many states does America have? 50. 5 plus 0 equals 5. Mark my words, if the United States ever adds another state, they will be asking for trouble. They use 5-pointed stars on their flags, military vehicles, etc. 5 is the number of Guru, or Brihaspati, the planet Jupiter, who is the world's protector. And 5 is also the number of magic and mystery. The Greeks used to go into battle with their word for 5 painted on their shields. Also, the American flag has 13 stripes. 1 plus 3 equals 4. 4 is the number for foundation, so their foundation is firm. As I always say, if the foundation is strong, the building will last. If not, it will surely fall. Surely you prefer the 6-pointed star to the 5-pointed star. Vimalananda used the 6-pointed star as the yantra in the bottom of his fire pit when he performed Homa. They are different, but they are both good. The Jews called the 6-pointed star the Star of David, and David was no fool to use the star. It is one of the reasons that the Israeli army always wins. You may not have noticed, but a 6-pointed star also appears in the Great Seal of the United States, made out of 13 individual stars. So America's foundation is good? Most of it is good, but they have performed some terrible karmas also. Don't forget that the Americans came into possession of America by theft. Armed robbery, in fact. They used firearms. Shouldn't armed robbery be a prominent part of their lives today? And since they stole the country by using the fire element, shouldn't they be made to suffer by the fire element? We see it already. The world is warming up. There are forest fires and droughts everywhere. And if there is ever a nuclear war, much of the world will be incinerated. And what about drilling oil wells and sucking oil out of the earth? The Americans have taught the world how best to prospect for oil and how to pump it up from the ground efficiently. Oil is the earth's blood, so shouldn't they have their blood sucked in return? They must. And look what their medical science is doing to them. It is sucking their blood. Every time one of them goes to a doctor, he gets at least one blood test. One thing is for sure, when all these karmas catch up with them, they will truly be ruined. The question is, when will these karmas catch up with them? As long as the Americans can just remain true to their heritage and remember to be generous, they will continue to prosper. Whether or not they are able to do so will depend on how well they can improve their own innate natures, their collective swabhava. It will also depend on how well their good qualities can continue to function in the face of the powerful distortion that the weight of all their evil karmas is creating. Thanks to Lord Rama's blessings, there is still some hope for them. Silence descended for a few moments before he continued. I tell you, Robbie, there is very little to karma, besides blessings and curses. Read the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and you will find blessings and curses on nearly every page, just as you find in your Bible too. I have already shown you how blessings and curses worked in the case of Prithviraj and Akbar. Now listen to how a blessing influenced a famous Western ruler. Long ago, there lived a rishi who was a kurma guru. From the outside, he would sit silently like a tortoise, which is kurma, seemingly inactive. But on the inside, he would secretly watch what his disciples were doing and would help and nourish them from a distance. In that ashram lived Shabari, an old Shudra lady who used to sweep and scrub to keep the place clean. One day, the rishi's pet disciple came by and felt compassion for her. He asked her, "Ma, do you do any kind of sadhana?" She replied, "My son, I am just a poor, illiterate woman. I know nothing of Sanskrit." The boy told her, "Ma, even if you can't recite the Veda, you can still call on God. You just repeat, 'Master, when will you come? Master, when will you come? I am making everything clean for you.' Repeat this all the time when you are doing your work and when you are at home, and you will see the result." He gave her this phrase as a mantra in her mother tongue, so she would be able to pronounce it. Whatever a rishi gives you to recite is a mantra, no matter what language it is in, or whether it is grammatically correct or not. That is the power of a rishi. Every day, all day long, Shabari repeated her mantra. She did it so long and so well that when Lord Rama, who was God incarnate on earth at that time, came that way, he stopped to meet her. He even had to accept her gift of jujube fruit to him. You see, in a rishi's ashram, all work according to their capabilities, and all get results. Isn't that the way it should be? The rishis never refused anyone if they were sincere. Shabari was so thrilled that Rama had come to her that she wanted everything to be perfect for him. In order to make sure that Rama would enjoy each fruit, she wanted to test them and make sure that they were sweet. So she bit into each jujube and tasted it first before giving it to him. Now, as you well know, people in India never offer any food to anyone else that they have already tasted. You would never offer such food to a guest, and most specifically, not to your lord and king. That would be one of the gravest of insults. And Shabari didn't know this? How could she not have known it? The upper caste people around her would have reminded her of it regularly. But her joy at seeing the Lord himself was so immense that she forgot everything except wanting to do her utmost to please him. When Rama looked inside Shabari and saw the depth of her devotion and sincerity, he ate those berries joyfully. Rama then blessed Shabari that she would rule as a queen in her next birth. This is the law of karma again. First the austerities, then the rewards. She had to wait many centuries until a good opportunity presented itself. But eventually Shabari became a queen. In fact, she became Queen Victoria, the Empress of all India. Even though her penance was not of a quality that would have enabled her to become an Indian ruler, she did have the qualifications to become queen of a nation of Asuras. The real reason that England, which is a nation of Shudras and Mlakchas, who are barbarians as far as we are concerned, was allowed to rule over us, was so that Shabari could rule India by ruling England. Because Shabari in her incarnation as Victoria had a vague remembrance of her previous life, some of her previous qualities shone through. This explains why she always believed in religious toleration. She was well loved as queen, and people still remember her favorably. Why, there's even a Victoria Memorial in Calcutta. And Victoria Terminus on the Central Railway right here in Bombay. Precisely. Now, after she died, Queen Victoria must have descended into some lower womb. This became inevitable because she did not persist with the austerities which had brought her into that position. Wasn't Queen Victoria distressed in her last days? Here again is the law of karma. You do austerities which result in great enjoyments, but then the enjoyments make you forget to continue your austerities, and down you go. Tapeshwari se Rajneshwari, or Rajeshwari se Narekshwari, meaning penance to riches, and riches to ruination. She needed someone to guide her. Where was her guru, the Rishi's disciple? Well, he had no desire to be born in the West, so she had to go there on her own. But he must still be around there somewhere, looking after her from afar, like a good Kurma guru should. The Rishis never forsake their children, even after both they and their children have left their bodies. There is no limitation of time, space, or causation when it comes to love. If Queen Victoria had really been lucky, she would have had the kind of positive influences around her that Akbar had around him when he became emperor. Despite his blood-stained heritage, he had so many saints blessing him, and had such good samskaras from his past birth as Prithviraj that he was able to overcome his inborn Svabhava. Akbar was truly lucky in that, like Birbal, almost all of the people around him were unique and amazing. Except his children. No, not at all, retorted Vimalananda, annoyed. If his son Salim was his greatest disappointment, one of his greatest satisfactions was his daughter Taj. His pet name for her was Dilaram. She was a very simple girl on the outside, but very deep within. Once Akbar asked her, Why don't you ever dress up well to impress the members of my court?" She replied, "But I am wearing 20 costumes," and to prove it, she took off all of them one by one. When the last was removed, she stood there with her hands covering her breasts, not her genitalia. Akbar accosted her furiously. "Shameless girl, what do you mean by standing like this before me? Where is your modesty?" She replied, "But father, you have seen me without clothes many times when I was young. Since then, these have grown," she said, as she indicated to her breasts, "and this," she said, indicating to her vulva, "has not. So I must cover these." What could Akbar say then? She was right. Another time she helped him win a crucial game of chess. You know, Akbar was an expert chess player, which is called shatarangi. He could think 100 moves ahead. For enjoyment, he would use the courtiers as chess pieces on the big chessboard of inlaid stone that he ordered laid out in his courtyard. You can still see it at Fatehpur Sikri. On this occasion, he had rather gone overboard. He was playing with one of his viceroys, and was so confident of his superior skills, he had bet the viceroy his kingdom with the added bonus of Dilaram for a wife. Unfortunately, Akbar was having an off game, and at one point he had to stop and think hard. He realized that unless he thought of something sensational, that he would be finished, checkmated, after his next move. Then Dilaram came to him and showed him how to win the game. She spoke in a couplet. "Move your rook like this, and he will have to move like this. He has no choice. Then move your pawn forward 2 squares, and he will be checkmated, and you will not lose your Dilaram." Akbar did as she advised and won. He tried to make her accept so many things as a reward, but she refused everything. She never married, and when Akbar died, she left everything and went to Gokul, where Krishna lived as a child. She was a great devotee of Krishna. When she got to Gokul, she said, "Here, Krishna, I have come to you," and she merged. A Muslim devotee of Krishna? Is that so hard to believe? Rasa Khan, the author of some of the greatest devotional songs of Krishna ever written, was also a Muslim. And so was Khani Kanan Rahim, the son of Akbar's boyhood advisor, Bairam Khan. Rahim was something else entirely. When he was governor of the province of Awadh, he used to bestow gifts with his hand uplifted and his eyes downcast to show that God was the real giver, not he. Rahim's wife, Aram Banu Begum, was Akbar's daughter. It was well known in court that a Muslim Rahim had become a devotee of Krishna. Some of the more bigoted Muslim courtiers were therefore always scheming against him, hoping to trip him up in some way so that he would be humiliated. After a number of abortive schemes, they came up with a metrical plot and proclaimed a poetry completion contest. In this sort of competition, the first line of a couplet is given, to which a second line must be appended. The prize goes to whoever creates the best second line, the line which best fits the first. This sort of challenge, which has been used in India since ancient days, was also used to identify someone who had long been missing or in hiding. In such cases, the line that would be publicized would be the first line of a couplet known only to the seeker and the person sought. The first line that was concocted for this competition was Kafir hai wo jo kayal nahi Islam ka, which translates something like this: whoever does not believe in Islam is an infidel. The bigots were sure that they had Rahim now. If in his second line he spoke favorably of Krishna, it would be a direct insult to Islam, and he could then be accused of blasphemy. If, on the other hand, he spoke favorably of Islam, everyone would know how weak his devotion for Krishna was, and how willing he was to compromise on his principles. His opportunism and his fear of loss of position and freedom would thus disgrace him. Rahim frankly did not like the idea of such a trial by verse. But, for some reason, Akbar insisted, giving Rahim no choice but to accede to his sovereign wishes. The fanatics could hardly wait for the month to pass, until the day of Rahim's dishonor, but soon enough that day arrived. All the poets who assembled before the emperor spoke glowingly of the greatness of Islam and the perfidies of the unbelievers. All, that is, except Rahim, who was kept for last, that the suspense might magnify the expected stigma. But when it became Rahim's turn, everyone was dumbfounded when he took the given line as the second line of his couplet, not the first. His couplet became Kayal hai wo lam, gesu mere pyar ghana shyam ka, kafir hai wo jo kayal nahi Islam ka, meaning, belief there is in that lam that is formed by the locks of my beloved Ghanshyam. A heretic is anyone who does not believe in this lam. Rahim had created a verse which actually praised Ghanshyam, meaning Krishna, by making a brilliant play on the Arabic word Islam, which can mean in Hindi, this lam, or Islam. The Arabic character for the sound lam is a stroke that looks something like the silhouette of someone's hair. Rahim could thus legitimately take the word Islam to mean these locks of hair, and could then say that the only true infidel is whoever fails to have faith in Krishna's hair, that is, in Krishna himself. All the zealots were, of course, quite discomfited by the sudden turn of events, but what could they do? He had beaten them fair and square. The emperor was overjoyed that Rahim had acquitted himself so brilliantly. But when he summoned Rahim for congratulations, Rahim told him, "Your Majesty, you became emperor thanks to my father, and it is partly thanks to my worship of Krishna that your rule has been maintained. To my knowledge, I have never given you any cause for censure, and yet you test me. You sanction this competition. Now I have lost interest in your court, and I am leaving your service." Despite Akbar's pleas, he left, and then Akbar's real problems began. This was not exactly a curse. No, Rahim was too noble a man to curse anyone, certainly not the man whose salt he had eaten for so long. No, he simply withdrew the prayers for protection which he had been regularly offering up all during that time that he had been in Akbar's service. Without those prayers, Akbar began to experience the effects of his own karmas more strongly. Akbar still survived for a while longer, for he was lucky enough to have been blessed by a number of saints. The Mughals as a dynasty had even been blessed by one of the Sikh gurus. But when some of the later Mughals tortured the later Sikh gurus, the Mughals lost that blessing. This led them to eventually lose India to the British. And how do you think the British lost India? They might still be ruling here and now, were it not for 3 curses delivered to them by 3 kings that they had treacherously overthrown and sent into exile. One was King Thibor of Burma, who was such a good sadhaka that he could even perform a little Vajroli. Another was Wajid Ali Shah, the ruler of Awadh, who had so perfected his sadhana that Krishna himself would come and dance before him. And the third was the last of the Mughals, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who was a true poet. His last poem was a heartbroken lament for his fate. How ill-starred you are, Zafar, that for your burial you could not even obtain 2 yards of earth in the by-lane of your beloved, namely India. At one time he had owned all of India. Now he retained not even 6 feet worth of his cherished country in which to be buried. And it was all because of the Britishers. Can you imagine the anguish that he and the other 2 rulers must have felt as they died? Anguish that was strong enough to bring the British down. That is the power of a real curse. So long as Victoria ruled, the Rishi's blessing protected her in her position as mistress of India. As soon as she died, these curses were set free, to exert their effects, since none of her successors had the kind of blessing that she had. Curses and blessings, the law of karma. Remember that, my boy, when you are over there in your country. My departure for the United States at the end of August 1980 coincided almost to the day with the start of my Sade Sati. During my absence from the scene, Vimalananda continued to procure horseflesh, beginning with Redstone, whose other half he purchased from Iraq Gadswala. He also obtained, in partnership with Temul, a very likely-looking filly that he named Meherunissa, in honor of Emperor Akbar's daughter-in-law. Kamal slipped out of Vimalananda's hands in early 1981. After cooling his hooves in first Lafange's stables and then Temul's yard without ever notching a win, we had sent him to be trained by Lalu Dalal. Lalu, who was a friend of Temul's, had approached Vimalananda with a promise to make Kamal win, and there seemed no reason not to let him try. Lalu trained mainly for Nawab Sahib, a refined member of the minor Muslim nobility, who sold jewels to pay for the corn bills of the horses that ran in colours resembling some peer's livery. One of Nawab Sahib's daughters became very friendly with Lalu. They were seen everywhere together. It was rumoured they were having an affair. Wags commented that such an affair was sensible use of her time, for it gave her a crow's nest view of Lalu's plans for Nawab Sahib's horses. Despite Dalal's promise, Kamal seemed to owe nothing to Vimalananda, for he continued to lose even there. But when Vimalananda requested Lalu to send Kamal back to Temul's yard, Lalu refused to do so until all the arrears had been cleared, and he counter-attacked by demanding immediate settlement of his unpaid bills for extras. Vimalananda being just then exceedingly low on cash, he had very little alternative but to transfer Kamal to Lalu in payment for those arrears, which seemed suspiciously high. Immediately after the transfer, Lalu shifted his horses east for the Hyderabad season, where Kamal won without further ado. That sudden win created great suspicion in all our minds. Lalu's explanation was a model of innocence. For some reason the horse decided to take a bit at last. All the hard work on him finally paid off. I only wish it had done so while you still owned him. Though we might doubt him, we had no way to challenge his version of the story, for horses are not machines. Just before I arrived in India, again in October 1981, Vimalananda lost his beloved dog Lizu, who had simply grown too old to continue to live. Vimalananda, who valued love above all else, was hit hard by the loss of this being who loved him purely and unconditionally. I tried to soften the shock of his blow by taking him on a round-the-world tour in December 1981 and January 1982. A sparkling win by his new filly Meherenusa on December 26, while he and I were at my parents' home in New Mexico, raised his spirits sufficiently to spur some of his old enthusiasm. He became so merry, in fact, that he was able to convince my teetotaler parents to sip a little champagne in Meherenusa's honor. Back in India in January 1982, Vimalananda went to Bangalore to settle with Kaswala for the other half of Stoney's second foal. He was accompanied by the scheming Miss Bambani, who was making noises about entering the racing business herself. But once in Bangalore, Vimalananda discovered that Kaswala had understood their agreement to be for half interest in the first foal only, not the second. Kaswala moreover wanted considerably more for the second foal than Vimalananda was willing or able to pay. As a sop, Kaswala offered him a good deal on another filly, which Vimalananda accepted reluctantly. His heart was set on Stoney's new foal, and he also questioned whether his filly's action, foot-jointed configuration, was a little too upright to be healthy. Kaswala assured him that this would be no problem. Vimalananda named her Ramakada, meaning toy. Though she did endear herself to us with her toy-like ways, her upright action did in fact interfere with her running, which did nothing to endear Kaswala to any of us. In February 1982, Vimalananda took me to meet his junior Guru Maharaj for the first time. He had not dared introduce me before, for he knew what junior Guru Maharaj could do to me if he lost his temper. In fact, Vimalananda had sent me off to the United States suddenly in May 1977, ostensibly to reconnect with my family, just days before Guru Maharaj arrived unannounced in Bombay for his first visit there since 1959. Even then, Vimalananda refused to let Junior Guru Maharaj in the door until Guru Maharaj promised that nothing would happen to Lizu so long as he remained there. Lizu had become a dog due to Guru Maharaj's curse, after all, and Guru Maharaj wanted to close out his karmic account with her to free himself of that Runanubandhana. On his part, Vimalananda wanted both to retain the love of his doggy as long as he could, and to continually remind Guru Maharaj of the repercussions of this curse. Guru Maharaj had migrated back to his place of residence before I made it back from the United States that year. After completing such a journey, he would not venture off his hill again for at least 12 years. If I was to meet him, I thus had no choice but to proceed to his mountain. Vimalananda accompanied me to protect me, as he had previously protected Lizu, and to get Guru Maharaj to agree to give Redstone the same kind of riderly treatment that he had given Stone Ice a decade before. Vimalananda wanted this in trade for doing some unspecified but essential work that Guru Maharaj wanted done. But Guru Maharaj was not ready to deal, and we had to leave empty-handed. At the door, Vimalananda said to Guru Maharaj, "At least do something for my boy here. Do some Rakta Shuddhi, which is purification of the blood, for him." At this, Guru Maharaj, whose love was truly unparalleled, stared at me with studied bluster, pulled hard on my hair, and started to sting me with slaps about the body. "So you want Rakta Shuddhi, do you?" he shouted, and after he had finished his work, he said, "Okay, that's Rakta Shuddhi." A beaming Vimalananda hugged me as we walked towards the car. What was that all about? I wondered aloud. Rakta Shuddhi. Great. He's removed a number of your karmas that have been perverting your mind. You'll be much improved now, whether you like it or not. I began to think that Vimalananda had partially turned me over to Guru Maharaj, as if saying, "I don't know what to do with this one, Maharaj. You handle him." As time went by, I discovered the truth of this surmise. Guru Maharaj later told me that he had to promise Vimalananda that he would not kill me while he was improving me. However, in the coming years, Guru Maharaj took pains to harass me over such things as my then girlfriend and my diet, and came near to causing me serious grief in the imbroglio over Aghori Baba's stick, which is another story. As Vimalananda and I drove away from Guru Maharaj on the day of that last meeting they were to have in the flesh, we saw two pigs coupling, a sight which sent Vimalananda into a rapture of joy. Guru Maharaj has not deserted me yet. Redstone will win very soon. And so he did. Shortly after Redstone's first win, I was sitting with Vimalananda in Bombay when Erak Kaswala called with the sad news of sudden deaths of both Stony and her new foal. I feared Vimalananda would become distraught, but he was actually happy. "She is free now," he said, "to take a better rebirth, to continue her development. Shouldn't I be overjoyed at that, if I truly love her? Moreover, I now have her son Redstone with me, so the karmic link continues. And besides, Erak didn't deserve to have her. He agreed to take her, not out of love for her, but because he thought he'd be able to make lots of money off her children. Breeding animals for sale is a big karma, even if you are not raising them for slaughter. This is why I never breed my Lizu. I had no place to keep all her puppies myself, and if I had given them away, I would not have been able to keep track of what was happening to them. If one had gone to a family that tortured it, I would have to bear most of the blame, because I had arranged for it to be brought into the world, and then because I had placed it with that family. Animals are as big a responsibility as people, or maybe even bigger, in that they can't speak up for themselves. Though I knew that Vimalananda had had some hand in the unexpected demise of mare and foal, I had seen him at work too often to think otherwise. He never admitted any complicity. Now that Redstone was the only son Stone Ice would ever foal, Vimalananda paid even more attention to him. And while we continued to pamper all the horses by bringing them carrots, apples, and other treats, Redstone received extra special pampering. One reason that Vimalananda liked Redstone was a certain haul of hair located in an auspicious spot on his body. He was also overjoyed that Redstone was not an asudar, a horse who will make you cry. In such animals, the wall on their forehead is so low that they can see it. And Asrudar makes you weep by mangling your prosperity. Either it will personally bankrupt you by losing when you have bet on it heavily, or it will make money for you even while it is causing your business to fail. Stone Ice's perfect star on her forehead, well above the line of her eyes, was one of the few things which made her lucky. Vimalananda, who had learned what he knew of horse markings from a Maharashtrian nobleman, the chief of Jat, would point out such signs to me when he saw them. One strongly propitious combination is the Panchakalayana, meaning 5 auspicious markings, which is defined as a horse who sports 4 white socks and a white forehead blaze. The American stud book, a copy of which I had brought Vimalananda from the United States, spurred his interest in Redstone's possibilities yet further. He would spend hours poring over the permutations and combinations created by such noble progenitors as Potu, Potos or potatoes, and Waxy, or studying the ramifications of the fact that about 90% of all thoroughbreds are descended from a single stallion named Eclipse, who was foaled during an eclipse and never lost a race. We pondered such questions as coat color, inheritance, chestnut, bay, brown, black, grey, red, roan, and blue roan, and why most of the issue in the line of a horse named Geranium had light-colored eyes. Equine, human, and divine lineages became a favored topic of our conversation, as he enhanced my knowledge both of horseflesh and of the genealogical complexities of Indian myth. Ancestry even crept into seemingly unrelated subjects, as it did on the evening of a day during which we had discussed with a vet effective treatments for the sand cracks that afflict the hooves of certain horses. Vimalananda began that evening by musing on the nature of the 3 gunas. Sattva meaning equilibrium, Rajas meaning activity, and Tamas meaning inertia. Devas basically have sattvic intellect, Asuras tamasic intellect, and humans rajasic intellect. To advance spiritually, you first replace Rajas and Tamas with Sattva in your consciousness, and then use Sattva to conquer Sattva itself, that you may go beyond the gunas. Good karma is basically something that helps free you from your runanubandhanas and the bondage of Rajas and Tamas. Bad karmas have the opposite effect. Enlightenment lies beyond the influence of all these gunas. As he was meandering along in this vein, inspiration suddenly hit him, and he slipped into story mode. It happened once during the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid that 3 marijuana smokers who were sitting in the main bazaar of the city of Baghdad started to have a loud argument about which of them was the greatest. They made such a noise that they were called in before the Caliph, who asked them who they were. Who were they actually? They were Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Now please listen. The first said, "I am an expert on horses, pedigrees." The second said, "I can tell everything about a man from his face." When the Caliph turned to the third, that man said, "I think it will be better if I don't tell your majesty who I am, because if I do, you will have my throat cut." This man's cheek immediately enraged the king, who ordered all 3 to be confined until he had some opportunity to test their abilities. The first two were housed together and received a regular ration from the palace kitchen, while the third, still smiling, was kept alone and got nothing to eat. One day, when the Caliph was in a peculiar frame of mind, he sent for the three and told them he was ready to take up the matter of their examinations. He brought out a horse and asked the first man if it was purebred. After looking it over, the man told the king, "Definitely not." The king became wild and said, "How can this horse, which is a present from the Shah of Iran, not be purebred? Tell me how you know, or you will die for it." The first man answered, "I merely looked at the crack in his hoof. All forest animals have cracked hooves. This horse must have also come from the forest where the rough ground has caused this crack." The king was so shocked that he could say nothing further. He then turned to the second man and said, "Now, I am of royal lineage or not? Tell me my true lineage." He was thinking that he would hear that he was of the family of the daughter of Hazrat Imam Hussein. Imagine his reaction when the second man prefaced his remarks with, "First promise me that you will not punish me for my bluntness," and said, upon receiving that promise, "You are the son of a cook." The king drew his sword, just as he had after the reply of the first, and said, "If you cannot prove that impossible statement, you will surely die." The man responded calmly, "Please ask your mother." The Caliph rushed to the harem, found his mother, and with drawn sword and eyes reddened with anger, demanded, "Who was my father? The late king or a cook?" His mother looked at him compassionately and said, "My son, your father was very old when we married. He could never produce children, and it greatly worried me that there was no heir to the throne. While I was wondering what to do, I noticed a young cook in the kitchen, strong and handsome to look at. You were conceived after we slept together." The somber Caliph returned to his court and said to the second man, "You were absolutely right, but how did you know?" The man answered, "It was very easy, your majesty. You sent us rations of food while we were being kept in your palace. No real king would keep an account of how much food his guests were eating. Only a cook would." Now the speechless king had nothing left to ask the third man, who was really Sattva. So he was given leave to go with the other two, without ever disclosing his own special capacity. After all, a spiritual man should never disclose his capacities to anyone. And the Caliph learned the lesson of his lifetime. The lineage question took a turn for the somber when in spring 1982 the war for the Falkland Islands began. This conflict, coupled with the ingratitude of certain Americans of his acquaintance, caused the lovely positivity that Vimalananda felt towards Westerners, which had swelled during his recent world tour, to evaporate with the sizzle of water on a hot girdle. While in the army, he had commanded Gurkhas and was proud of the way they acquitted themselves during this invasion. But he was contemptuous of the operation as a whole. "The Brits have been very lucky in this war," he observed sourly, "to have America helping them. Otherwise their entire invasion fleet would have been sunk by now by the Argentine Air Force. The Americans were very clever. they sold the right bombs to the Argentines, but gave them the wrong fuses. Without the right fuses, how would they explode? Would the Americans have dared to do this to anyone else? No. Thatcher was very clever. She played on Reagan's prejudices by subtly suggesting to him that the Anglo-Saxon countries should stick together. And Reagan fell for her bait, hook, line and sinker. But Thatcher is no Victoria, and if she thinks that war can salvage for Britain what is left of its empire, she had best think again. The law of karma is no respecter of persons, places or things. Britain would have been wiser to recognize that its day in the sun is past, and to gracefully yield her position of preeminence. Had the United Kingdom settled with the Argentine government, its grateful populace would have showered the Brits with blessings, which they urgently require. Instead, Thatcher had opened herself and her country to the effects of still more curses, which will enlarge their burdens of karmic debt. This war is going to cost both of them dearly, karmically as well as monetarily. But what about the karma of the Argentines? They must have done something to deserve this. They must have. That is the law of karma. Their soldiers killed in the field were destined to die at the hands of those Brits and Gurkhas who invaded. That is fairly straightforward. As for the Argentine generals, well, think of the mountain of evil karmas they had created for themselves by causing so many innocent people to disappear. Those karmas had to catch up with them someday. But this defeat is just the beginning for the generals, isn't it? Oh yes, they have plenty of blood on their hands. They have a lot to suffer yet. The law of karma will take good care of them, just like it took care of the Shah of Iran. You are speaking now of the most recent Shah of Iran, the man who is said to have installed a solid gold toilet on his personal jet? Yes, that Shah. Do you remember that he staged his coronation at the ancient Persian capital of Persepolis? I do. Persepolis had been a deserted ruin for hundreds of years, until the Shah got into his mind to be crowned there. He wanted to show everyone that he was the legitimate successor to the great Persian emperors of yore, like Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes. But he forgot to ask himself whether those great rulers would enjoy having their ancient citadel invaded by some inconsequential nincompoop. When the Shah's antics aroused the spirits of those monarchs from their sleep of death, they asked themselves, "Who is this pipsqueak who dares to strut about, comparing himself to us?" When they looked down on him, they saw not a king, but an insignificant son of an insignificant cavalry officer who had made himself Shah after a palace coup. All they could hear when the Shah spoke was the blaring of an insolent pup. The impudence of this Shah, who lacked everything that is Shahi, meaning regal or majestic, so infuriated the dead emperors that they cursed him. Those were the curses that ended the Shah's reign, just as surely as the curses of King Thibaw, Wajid al-Shahi, and Bahadur Shah Zafar destroyed the British Empire. If the Shah had remembered who he was and not tried to pretend to be something that he was not, he might be ruling Iran today. Would it have made a difference if the Shah had actually had some pedigree, if he had actually been descended from conquerors? It might have, At the very least, it would have made him understand the gravity of the situation into which he was thrusting himself. Do we think this was Saturn who put this coronation idea into the Shah's mind? Who else could do it? The Shah's good karmas had obviously run out, and it had become time for him to experience the results of his myriad evil karmas. Vinasha kale viparita buddhi. When the time for your destruction arrives, your mind becomes perverted. And Saturn is just the being to pervert it for you. That is his job. He certainly does it well. Remember that whenever you remember him. After Redstone's next convincing win in the late spring of 1982, Vimalananda began to suspect that he had a horse who could go a long way off, who could win one of India's classic races. The horses entrained for Pune shortly after, and on our way to inspect them, he had shared his feelings with me. You know, Robbie, I thought I had lost my will to live, but I haven't. Not yet. There's life in the old boy still, and for this I have to thank Mamra Bahin. I never wanted to get back into racing, but she forced me to return. She did it for her own purposes, no doubt, but just as I blame her for some of my problems, I have to thank her for some of my enjoyments, which are due, at least in part, to her insistence. He paused, as if in thought, and then began abruptly. Some years back, a certain sadhu lived in Girnar with a few disciples. One day, he decided to go off a little way into the jungle and sit in meditation. He was really a good sadhu, and after a short while, he was doing so well that Indra became frightened and decided to send an apasara down to disturb him. In the mythology of the Puranas, Indra is always sending some apasaras or another down to disturb some sadhu or another, for a hard-working sadhu who performs enough penance may be elevated by the powers that be to the Indra state, and every Indra will try to protect his own position. The apasaras appeared in front of him to tantalize him, but he was so deep in meditation that he didn't know what was going on around him. Then she used a siddhi to become tiny and started to dance on him. Still no effect. First she danced on his body, then on his face. Then she jumped onto his matted locks. At first the sadhu felt a disturbance, perceived what was going on, and lost his temper. He said to her, "Become a female monkey." Immediately she became a female monkey. When she realized what had happened, she began to cry, but he told her to keep quiet and not to worry. He took her back to the ashram and ordered his disciples to feed her sweets and good food whenever she was hungry. Not long after that, the sadhu left his body, and the monkey lived on in the ashram. When the monkey died, she was cremated, and her memorial was placed next to that of the sadhu. Look at what happened here. Even though the sadhu escaped falling prey to the blandishments of the apsaras, he still created some karma for himself, but lost some of his shakti by losing his temper. Similarly, a whole train of karmas has been initiated because of Mamrabahin, but now, at least with Redstone, there is a chance that we will see some good results of all our work. Nature is so kind. He fell silent as we entered the ghats, meaning hills, where all his concentration would be needed, and he had me toss a coin, as all drivers did, to the shrine at the foot of the chief hill. The Konkan coastal strip that contains Bombay is connected with the Deccan Plateau, where sits Pune, by a road which climbs 2,000 feet in the space of a couple of miles. At the time that Vimalananda and I drove it together, it was a 2-lane highway crowded with the usual Indian transport panoply of trucks, buses, cars, motorcycles, bullock carts, and the occasional stray bicyclist, pedestrian and animal. Climbing the ghats was exceptionally stressful because of the need to maintain forward momentum without collision and without overheating the engine. My sensory awareness became effortlessly heightened when riding with Vimalananda on the ghat section of the Bombay-Pune road, as he meticulously preserved gaps between our vehicle and those on the opposite side of the road. I often watched him merrily miss oncoming conveyances by literally no more than an inch or two. "Gauging," he would say. "It's all a matter of gauging. When your gauging is good, you can drive confidently, whether it be on the road or through life." I had no anxiety as he gauged his way through the ghats, since I knew well how well he could control his car. But when he reached that last inch, the self-preservation instinct would still send a surge of adrenaline through me anyway, to remind me of my mortality. One day, as we were driving back into Bombay from Pune, Vimalananda was so busy chatting with our guest, a horse owner named Willie D'Souza, that he failed to notice that the traffic light in front of us had turned red. In some amazement, Willie and I watched Vimalananda forget to stop, but we were less astonished than was the man who had begun to cross the street at about the same time that we barreled into the intersection. Resentment, incredulity, and inspired aggravation flitted in succession across his face as he hurled out of the way. I was not concerned for his life. Bombay pedestrians are fleet of foot, but I was somewhat troubled that Vimalananda was not too troubled. Seeing this, and eyeing the startled D'Souza, he commented as he drove on, "You should know by now, Robbie, that someone is there to prevent me from getting into serious trouble, even when I goof. And the fellow was not even in serious danger. He had plenty of time to escape. But the look on his face, that was priceless." I had a much worse problem that day. I was driving down a road right here in Bombay when all of a sudden, without warning whatsoever, both front wheels fell off. I was shocked, I tell you, shocked. There I sat in the middle of the road, holding my useless steering wheel, as I watched my wheels spade away from me. One ended up safely by the side of the road, but the other one rolled all the way across the street and bowled over a bystander. He had to be rushed to hospital, but fortunately was not too seriously injured. D'Souza and I were now impolitely laughing at the vision of two wayward wheels fleeing the stunned Vimalananda. "There is no security in life, I tell you," he went on. "One minute you are standing there calmly, minding your own business, and the next you're lying on the street, flattened by a runaway tire." The next day, as I helped Vimalananda cook lunch, I was again reminded of his command over gauging. After we put the food on the fire and went to sit in the other room, Vimalananda said, "There is really no end to what you can learn. You know how much I love to cook, and many people have enjoyed my food. I think you will agree with me on that. I have always enjoyed your food. And you know that I have an advantage no Western chef has, thanks to the blessings of Annapurna, the goddess of food. Did I ever tell you what happened when Faram's wife burned the meat? No, I don't think you have. Well, she burned it absolutely black. She charred it. Faram, as usual, lost his temper and started to shout at her. In the interest of family harmony, I told him to shut up and told her, "Ma, please wash all the pieces of meat with soap and water." She couldn't help laughing and said, "Do you know what that will do to it?" I said, "It's spoiled anyway, isn't it? So just wash it and don't argue with me, please." She washed it. I cooked it, and it came out perfect without even a hint of burned flavor. I had seen his wizardry in the kitchen first-hand, close up, so I believed the story instantly. "Oh, and by the way, Robbie, the food is cooking a little too fast. Turn the fire down just slightly." Whenever I put a pot on the fire in a kitchen run by Vimalananda, I knew that I could safely leave it to cook on its own, in the absolute certainty that the moment anything went wrong, he would tell me. This was the power of his gauging. I adjusted the fire, then thanked him for his care. He took a histrionic whiff of air, and then said, "Yes, it is. Sometimes when other people are cooking," he chuckled, "they try to show off how expert they are. I don't like show-offs, so I can't help but have a little fun. When they turn away from the food for a moment, I will shout, 'Quick, turn off the fire, the food is burning!' And before anyone will be able to get there, the food will be burnt." I laughed too, and was about to tell him what a show-off he was, when he retorted, "Well, if they have the ability to show it off, who will stop them? What I object to is fakery, pretending to be something you are not. If they were so smart, they should be able to turn down the fire from where they are sitting just as easily as I can turn it up." Vimalananda's intolerance for pretenders had more than once before inspired him to show me just how little the run-of-the-mill swamis in India really walked his talk. Such people show a trick or two and mislead the public into thinking they are some sort of super-dupers, he would say, before cutting another godman down to size. I know one who claims to talk Parashurama face to face. Now, Parashurama is a real Bhagwan, God incarnate, one of the 10 avatars. Anyone who sees Parashurama loses all interest in worldly things and spends all his time alone. His only answer to people's questions will be, "Leave me alone." Why? Because that is Parashurama's nature. Parashurama, who is also known as Bhargava, loves to be alone. He lives almost exclusively on the astral planes and above. Bhargava is also continuously moving, which means that his devotee would also go on the move. If he doesn't, and if he says he wants money and an ashram and all sorts of other things, is it logically possible to conclude that he talks to Parashurama face to face? You tell me. Haven't you ever pretended to be something you're not? I asked in mild pique one day, after such a diatribe. Of course I have, he said with a laugh at himself, as a memory reared up within him. Once I was staying with a friend at Dak Bungalow, which is a sort of rest house for visiting dignitaries that the government maintains in small towns that lack hotels. A barber had come to shave me, and when he had me lathered up, he said, "You know, sir, you look just like Chandra Mohan, who was a famous movie star of that time. He was a good actor. If you ever get a chance, Robbie, go and see the movie Pukar. Chandra Mohan does a beautiful job of playing the Emperor Jahangir in that film. I don't know what came over me, but when the Baba said this, I smiled and nodded to myself, as if to say, yes, I am Chandra Mohan. I never actually said it in so many words, that I was. That would have been too deceptive. But I didn't correct his misimpression either. The thought that he was shaving the great Chandra Mohan fired up within that Baba, so he did an excellent job on my beard. After he left, I thought the charade was at an end, and I lay down to take a nap. I had forgotten, though, that I was in a small town. In Indian villages and towns, the Babas act as the news networks. When my companion woke me in alarm from my nap, I looked out the window to find the entire duck bungalow surrounded by anxious fans, all hoping to see or touch or be touched by the great Chandra Mohan. It was a hell of a job to extract ourselves from that situation, let me tell you. Ever since then, I have thought many times before, trying to pretend that I am something that I'm not. But even in the great Chandra Mohan case, I only imitated an actor, not a saint. To imitate a saint is to ask for real trouble. Don't forget the sadhus in Girnar. What happened to them? Some years back, one of the Nawabs of Jongad, which is the principality at the base of Mount Girnar, got so fed up with all these fake sadhus and fakirs who were crowding Girnar that he had his men round them all up. Then he addressed them. You shameless idlers! How dare you lie around all day pretending to meditate? I know that most of you are criminals and good-for-nothings. If you are real sadhus, prove it to me. Show me a miracle. If you can't show me a miracle, you are going to have to start working for your food. None of the men was a real saint, so none of them could perform a miracle. The Nawab accordingly had his soldiers put each of them in front of a chakki, which is a grinding stone, which they had to turn by hand all day long, grinding grain into flour. All these phony holy men bellyached like crazy as they worked, but now it was too late for them to get by just by pretending to be pious. Finally, one really good sadhu who had escaped the Nawab's dragnet came to hear of their humiliation and came down from the mountain to confront the Nawab. Who was he? I don't know. I could see that he did. This sadhu told the prince, even if these fellows are crooks, you were wrong to lock them up. The Nawab had no intention of letting some sadhu presume to tell him what to do. He replied, since you have such a soft spot for these slackers, why don't you go join them in the horsegow? The sadhu shrugged his shoulders and, accompanied by a police escort, went to the prison, where he addressed the inmates. When I look at you, I am ashamed to be wearing my girwa, which is an ochre-colored renunciate's clothing. You have stained it with your hypocrisy. What kind of sadhus and fakirs are you? When the Nawab asked for a miracle, could none of you oblige? Stand back. Then the sadhu shouted, Chakki chalo, dhana piso, meaning turn grindstones, grind the grain. After that, all the stones began to turn on their own. Amazed, the jailers ran to summon the Nawab, who, appropriately impressed by this demonstration, he told the sadhu, yes, you are the real thing. You can go. The sadhu replied, no, Nawab Sahib, I can't go alone. Everyone must come with me. Though the Nawab was reluctant to let the frauds go, he could not deny the sadhu, and had set all the sadhus and fakirs free. As they left the jail, the good sadhu told them, See that you perform your penance properly from now on. If you fail again, you will be expelled from Girnar." Did that lesson reform all those lazy bones? Yes, for a while, until their natural swabhavas asserted themselves. Well, it is very difficult to conquer your nature even after you have devoted your life to sadhana. Fortunately, someone is always there to test anyone who claims to have his nature under control. Vimalananda's love of staging practical examinations of putative saints led him one day to take me with him to pay a call on a Baba. Our visit was a stopover during a test drive of a used car that Vimalananda was thinking of purchasing, and the hour we spent cooling our heels before he could see the great man did nothing to improve Vimalananda's temper. Still, as soon as we were ushered into the august presence, Vimalananda bowed to him very low to show humility. This pleased the Baba a great deal. Then he asked Vimalananda what sort of business he was in, and Vimalananda replied, "The machinery business." "Oh," replied the Baba, "machinery business, very good business." Then he opened his hand and some ash poured out onto our expectant palms, for he was one of those people who make things like ash appear from thin air. I collected both heaps of ash in small pieces of paper and folded them into little bundles, which I put into the car's glove compartment after we had said our goodbyes. I accidentally left them there when we returned the car, and within the week the car got smashed both from the front and from the rear. Shortly thereafter, the Baba had a heart attack and later came down with other diseases. Vimalananda claimed not to know how any of this had happened, calling it a coincidence. If so, it was a truly conspicuous coincidence. I was mightily impressed. "I began by touching his feet," replied Vimalananda when I brought up the subject, "because in India, when you meet a saint, you always touch his feet. Touching shows humility, but more importantly, it allows you to steal some of the saint's energy. Generally, energy enters the body through the head and exits through the feet. A true saint is the embodiment of his deity, and the energy emanating from him is the energy of that deity. By touching a saint's feet, you collect a little of that energy, which purifies your own consciousness and makes it more subtle. The saint loses some of his own peace of mind by this, which is unfortunate for the saint. This is how many saints go bad. First, they achieve a good state, maybe by doing hard penances in strict seclusion. Then, when they come back into the world, they start absorbing the confusion and attachment of their devotees, and they too become worldly. A sensible saint will never let anyone touch his feet except on special occasions like Guru Purnima. Anyone with subtle intelligence who touches a saint's feet will be able to learn a great deal about that saint's innate qualities. Touching this fellow's feet was my first test. I wanted to see how sensible he was and how much energy he had. He unfortunately scored 0 on both counts. Next came the question of my business. If he had any kind of real power at all, he should have been able to know that I was in the horse race business and not the machinery business. But he had nothing except ash, which did not impress me. There are so many ways in which to produce ash and trinkets from what seems to be nowhere. It's too bad that the old man is unwell, but he should have known better than to try to show off. I am just sorry for the poor car. That ash was the cause of its ruination. Now you see how sticky karma can be. Don't you think you were a little hard on him? Hard? I was hard on Tat Maharaj. Tat means gunny sack, which is what this fellow wore. One of my friends brought me to Tat Maharaj by telling me he could sit in samadhi for hours at a time while his followers sang and chanted. I didn't believe it, so I went to have his darshana, which is a viewing of a saint or deity. Sure enough, I could see that he was merely closing his eyes and fooling everyone. On top of that, I was supposed to bow down to him. While I waited there, I examined the room carefully and came up with a plan. Back at home, I sharpened the point of a long iron nail until it was razor sharp. A few days later, I returned to Tat Maharaj and got into line to touch his lotus feet. When I got to the head of the line, I bent down, raised the nail high above my head, and jabbed it into his foot. My God, what a howl came from that charlatan! His bellowings even drowned out the warbles of his singers. Wouldn't most people have responded to a nail in the foot, even if they were in samadhi? No, not if the samadhi is genuine. A person who is in samadhi has no knowledge whatsoever of the outside world, so long as he remains in samadhi. If Tat Maharaj had actually been in samadhi, he would have felt nothing from that nail, not even a pinprick. But he was just pretending, so he felt it all. Everyone was so stunned that I had time to rush out the door to where an accomplice was waiting in the getaway car, and off we sped. I don't like to think what might have happened to me had I been caught. Was there no karma involved in that little escapade? There is karma involved in every activity, but this karma was worth it to me, to see that impostor unmasked. I do have certain advantages in this department. The advantages of knowing my own karmas and runanubandhanas, and I can assure you that he deserved what he got from me. Unless you know your runanubandhanas, though, and know how to negate your karmas, never try any stunts like this. Knowledge of his runanubandhanas and how to negate them seemed to spur Vimalananda into action when one of the doctors at my college sang the praises of one Dada Maharaj, who was reputed by some in Pune to be a great saint. "We must go have his darshana," said Vimalananda enthusiastically when he heard this news. "Ha! So now this fellow's time is up," I replied with some sarcasm. "Robbie," said Vimalananda, feigning hurt, "am I that bad? Just because you have seen a few coincidences, should you always make fun of me when I go and meet some saint? What about Madhava Baba?" Vimalananda's appreciation for the genuine article caused us always to visit Madhava Baba Patil whenever he came to Pune. Mavad Baba, who lived some 2 hours or more south of Pune in Narso Bawadi, had been so thorough in his sadhana that now he spent all his time in some world other than ours, lost in contemplation of his beloved. Vimalananda, who had known Madhav Baba for many years, respected him as a good sadhaka, but for his part, Madhav Baba, who never appeared to recognize most people but blessed all indiscriminately, always recognized and remembered Vimalananda. But I knew Madhav Baba was different, and indeed my prediction regarding this Dada Maharaj proved to be true. When first we went to Dada Maharaj, he met us perfunctorily and informed us that he had no time for us. Perhaps we didn't seem sufficiently important to him. The very next day, however, he called us back and personally welcomed us when we came, explaining that he had been soundly remonstrated for his gaffe in a dream the night before, and wanted to make amends for his negligence. He verbally pictured for us his spiritual adventures in Rishikesh, when he had seen angels ascending and descending divine staircases, and then described such other visions as seemed to impress his raptly listening retainers. But as we sat listening politely, I could see from the set of Vimalananda's eyes that he felt his work there to be completed. His interest in Dada Maharaj evaporated promptly as it had developed, and the old man did in fact die just a few months later. During the 1982 monsoon, Vimalananda spent even more time than usual in Pune, focusing most of his energies on Redstone's progress. During the monsoon, it is easier to focus on almost anything in Pune rather than in Bombay, when the rain falls like Thor's hammer onto the backs of anyone unwise enough to get caught out in a downpour. Once or twice each year, it rains 18 inches or more in a single day. Then, the overworked storm sewers, which can ordinarily handle up to a foot of rain daily, overflow to send 9 months' worth of accumulated muck into the laps of the luckless commuters, scurrying back to homes glazed with mold and mildew. The Pune monsoon, by contrast, is better behaved. It rarely rains more than a drizzle during the day, reserving most of its deluges for evenings and nights. The rare heavy rain there is at most 7 or 8 inches. Pune during the monsoon is like an English city during a warm spell, temperate, green and inviting. It is at its pleasantest then, and the racing is cool and elegant. When Redstone won yet another race, this time on the Pune course's verdant turf, Vimalananda determined to try him in the premier run-up race for the classics, the Colonel Pratap Singh of Jodhpur Cup. Part of Vimalananda's fondness of the race derived from its namesake, Colonel Pratap Singh, sometimes known as the Bayard of India, who was one of Queen Victoria's aides-de-camp, who helped lead the Indian Army in France during the First World War. The only problem, he told me, was that it was supposed to be a hoodoo race. No horse who ever won seemed to win any of the classics. A hoodoo race? I asked. You mean races can be cursed too? Anything can be cursed, he replied. Houses, cars, clothes. And what about the Hope Diamond? I wouldn't have it, even if it was given to me. First of all, it was pried loose from a stone image in the South Indian temple, which was hardly likely to put the deity from whom it was stolen in a good mood. And look at its history. Calamity has followed everyone who has ever possessed it. That in itself should be an indication enough that it is cursed. So why not races? Do you think that Colonel Pratap Singh is a hoodoo race? Whether or not it is, I have decided to run Redstone in it. If he can't win it, it will prove that he's not classics material anyway. Why live in fear? Better to go for broke. And so we did. As the countdown for the big race ticked by, we exhaustively evaluated Redstone's track work, fitness, appetite, and general mood, and kept our fingers thoroughly crossed. In our spare time, we made excursions to those local beings, humans and ethereal, with whom we had beneficial runanubandhanas. One evening, we drove to the Sindhi colony in Ayund, near Pune, to meet a family related to one of Vimalananda's children. These people were bickering among themselves continually and suffering from disease one after another. When Vimalananda visited them, he immediately detected the problem. A large banyan tree nearby. No one dared to sleep under the tree at night, for it had a reputation. Vimalananda changed all that, as he has done with many other trees around India which have become his friends, and asked the head of the household to offer incense to the tree each week. The man, who must have thought he was very clever, offered incense daily instead, until the spirit in the tree came and stood in front of him and asked him what his intentions were. This terrified him enough to remember Vimalananda's words and to revert to a weekly offering. Now everyone in the house is well, Vimalananda commented. All the family members cooperate with each other, and the warehouse of the family business is never empty. No matter how much is removed from the warehouse, something always remains there. Many other people have seen this tree, offered it incense, and obtained results. Now the family is happy with me, and the tree is also happy with me, and their combined blessings add all the more to my karmic account balance as we prepare for Redstone's test. The greatest time squandering of the entire process centered around Das Baba, a tantric from Gujarat who claimed to be able to ensure Redstone's success. Vimalananda was always on the lookout for someone who could give him the reliable race results needed to make money at the track, so that he could evade the karma of divining the results himself. He followed the path laid out in a Marathi saying, Pan Vyacha Sota ne Vichu Mar, meaning kill the scorpion with the guess staff. Why soil your own walking stick with the scorpion venom of karma if you can soil someone else's? Substitute penis for staff if you prefer the ribald interpretation of the word sutta. He interviewed quite a number of candidates, astrologers, mediums, and one fellow who brought with him a little boy and a dark scrying glass for the boy to gaze into. All these previous contestants had flopped abjectly, however. No matter how expert they might be for other people in other places, they always failed with Vimalananda. Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps it was not Vimalananda's destiny to win that way. More likely it was Vimalananda teaching them valuable lessons. Das Baba had been brought to us by Mr. Bundledas, a semi-nobleman with delusions of efficacy. The Baba made tall claims of having magically fixed bullock races and stuffed ballot boxes by ethereal means. After Vimalananda saw some of his capabilities at first hand, he lost some of his preliminary doubts about the man's potential, but he was under no illusions as to the source of Das Bapu's powers. I do not doubt that he has done good avishkaras before, said Vimalananda. He has been possessed by the likes of Mahakali and of Anjanya. But you haven't forgotten what happened at the caves, have you? He claimed he was going to do an avishkara of the spirit of the great Guru Gorakhnath. But Gorakhnath was there just part of the time. The rest of the time it was just some ordinary little spirit playing about. But of course, how could he have expected more? Should we imagine that Gorakhnath, who is an immortal, has nothing better to do than commune with such a mediocre mortal as Das Bapa? And that too, someone with so much karma on his hands? To do much of their work, Das Bapa and his own guru have tortured many Dakinis, who are the spirits of women who died in pregnancy or childbirth, and have not even spared the spirits of tiny babies. You just have no idea of how horrible is the price you have to pay if you fool about with these rituals. How about the karmic implications for us if he does some work for us? First, he has offered to do this work of his own accord. He is thinking of some way to eventually profit from us, of course. He is not trying to help us because he loves us. But that's not the point. The point is that I didn't ask him to do the work, which makes an immense karmic difference. And besides, we first need to see whether or not nature will permit him to do anything for us before we worry about how to apportion karmic blame or praise. Right now, Das Bapa is dancing on the strength of that spirit named Bhima Bapa that he keeps with him. Well, we can stop that, and then we'll see how much water he's swimming in. Is digging up dead babies and pregnant women some sort of very primitive Nara Bali? It could be, but it is not in the way that Das Baba does it, because he is not offering those spirits to Ma. He is enslaving them for his own use. It is true that from one point of view, everything is sacrifice, including devotion, yoga, and even magic. But Das Bapa's kind of sacrifice is very selfish, and the karma for it will stick to him like glue. This is why the best sacrifice, the best Narabali of all, is the sacrifice of your own self. Offer yourself and all you possess, including your most precious possession, your life, to Ma, and she will save you. But she is not going to save Das Bapa. Just waiting until these spirits get their revenge, and then you will see how far away from Narabali Das Bapa is. Das Bapa was far away from us in Pune during the next 10 days, 3/4 of an hour away, in fact, holed up in a quiet of the Fruitwala Dharamsala in Alandi, testing out his predictive methods. Every day Vimalananda sent me, grumbling, to Alandi, astride Arzu's motor scooter, to inquire after Das Bapa's health, ask about any necessities to be brought to him or his assistant from Pune, and remind him by my presence that we were expecting results. To me it was a complete waste of 2 hours each day, as I was becoming surer and surer that Vimalananda was planning to have Das Bapa's head on a platter. Das Bapa and his man Friday resurfaced in Pune just in time for his first quiz, which took place on the race day that fell on the Sunday before the big race. We had expected a straightforward list of winners, and what we got was Das Bapa insisting on accompanying us to the track so that he could examine the runners. It was embarrassing to be seen with him, and galling to have to listen to his advice. Though he did predict one winner, or maybe it was two, neither was unexpected, based on nothing more magical than fitness and form. While he and his cheering section of one crowded over his glorious success, it became clear to the rest of us that all that was left to do with him was to boot him out of our lives as graciously as possible. This task was now more difficult, as he had begun to protest confidently that after seeing the track, he now had the necessary range to do a good job of predicting the results of next week's races. We packed him off to Alandi again without delay to refine his technique. During this week, Vimalananda thankfully did not force me to make fruitless runs to Alandi. Instead, he sent me to plumb Redstone's prospects at the Buleshwar, Shiva temple. Vimalananda's first journey to Buleshwar had been with Dr. Lad. They had set out in search of a different temple, but took the wrong road and discovered Buleshwar. When I accompanied Vimalananda on his second Buleshwar trek, we took a different, wrong road, up the wrong hillside, following the pavement even after it turned to dirt and then became a track. When we pressed ahead, we found ourselves alone and roadless on the hillside, squarely amidst a flock of goats. A sweetly smiling young goatherd then fortuitously appeared to navigate for Vimalananda, as he backed up the hill and down to the paved road, whence we drove off to find the right road and the shrine. On our third expedition we reached the right hill, but in the deepening twilight took the wrong fork of the road at its base. We then found ourselves ascending by the old road, which had been condemned. It was much too late to turn back when our thoroughfare suddenly deteriorated into a steeply climbing, uneven field of fist-sized rocks without any semblance of a guardrail. Only the sum of our collective good karmas, the weight of our tank-like Austin-Cambridge station wagon, and Vimalananda's determination, pluck, and driving skill got us up that hill. But clatter we did, and enjoyed our darshana. Thereafter, having learned from our experiences and having passed these tests that Shiva, or whoever, had set for us, we made regular safe outings to the sanctuary. Buleshwar's architecture, which is unique in that region of Western India, suggests that it was built as a fortified tantric monastery, though no one knows who the tantrics were or how long they remained in residence there. Whoever it was that held the fort in the latter part of the 18th century appears to have run afoul of India's then paramount power in the person of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, who dispatched his relative Shaista Khan to crush their resistance. Shaista Khan presumably invested the base of the hill and laid siege to the monastery, which cannot have held out for very long, since its sole source of water is a small cistern within a bat-infested cave. On some fateful day, the remaining residents must have sallied out to be slaughtered. The astral scent of violent death is thickly palpable in the vicinity. Enough local people have seen enough spirits of the unquiet dead that none of them stays overnight at Buleshwar if they can avoid it. When I once spent 10 days there meditating in the old guardhouse, I could at night hear faint sounds of battle wafting up to me from below, and felt acutely the nearby presence of ethereal warriors. On one memorable evening, a ghost outfitted in a battle armor went so far as to careen through my room. He paid no attention to me and sped on without stopping, engrossed as he was in his ancient unseen tussle, submerged in his memories of killing and being killed. Devout visitors to Buleshwar walk first down to the cistern to wash their hands and feet, taking care not to drink its water before filtering it through a cloth to remove any lurking guinea worm larvae. Then they follow from the cistern to the temple, a path that is lined with stone heads and torsos that Shaista Khan's men hacked from the monastery's walls. Only vestiges survive of the erotica that once adorned the temple's exterior. Much exquisite sculpture still remains within, including scenes from the Ramayana and Mahabharata, a giant bull, and a female Ganesha. But here also the raiders savaged the figures, and most of them are missing limbs. Inside the sanctum sits a stone Shiva Linga, which is a phallic symbol of Shiva, which is unusual not for its shape or size, but because it can be lifted from its base. Such lingas are ordinarily regarded as worthless, but at Buleshwar, water perpetually seeps from some unplumbed shaft into the small cavity which the linga covers. A pujari, which is a ritual priest, after removing a little of this water for the worshippers to sip as Shiva's blessings, places into the cavity a small metal dish filled with some pieces of the bananas and milk sweets that have been presented for offering, and closes the cavity with the linga. Then everyone sits patiently, sometimes for several minutes, for a peculiar scratching sound. Once the sound both comes and dies away, the linga is again removed, and voila! Some of the offerings have disappeared. Our first thought was that some sort of rodent must be entering the cavity to eat the food, but on close inspection, we discovered that none of the holes within the cavity are large enough to admit any but the smallest of mice. Moreover, we on occasion offered the sacred to Shiva bilva leaves, which were also consumed by this mysterious beast. And what self-respecting small animal would choose bitter leaves over sweet treats? It was a mystery over which we expended much conversation. We lost interest in what was taking the food on the day we realized that the quantity taken could provide answers to questions. When everything was taken, the answer was an unqualified yes. When one or two pieces remained, the answer was yes, with limitations. And if only one or two pieces were taken, the answer was limited success. No pieces taken, the answer an unqualified no. This mode of divination could be used for lost objects, employment opportunities, and most other inquiry, provided that everyone were focused on a single query. Once Vimalananda determined to use buleshwar as an oracle for his runners, I was making regular, fatiguing pilgrimages to the spot. Never, over the many months that I consulted it for this purpose, were its predictions wrong. Everything taken meant a winner. A few pieces remained, indicated that the horse would win some stakes money by placing second, third, or fourth, and only one or two pieces taken, or none at all, meant the horse finishes well in the back. On this occasion, everything went smoothly. My bus was on time, clouds shaded me from the sun during both my walk up and my walk down. The marvelous tree behind the temple sported an excellent complexion, and each and every piece of my offering was lifted. I consequently went into an excellent humour, as did Vimalananda as he heard those details. Our frame of mind remained thus until the following afternoon, when we happened to run into one of the stipendiary stewards as we were leaving the stables. This conspicuous gentleman peered over his nose at us in a way that he presumed to be dignified, smiled disdainfully, and observed to Vimalananda that he was very courageous to enter his nice little horse in such a big race. I saw fury infuse Vimalananda's face as he controlled himself and said something neutral, like, "He will acquit himself well, God willing." Back in the hotel, he said to me coldly, "When all this is over, I am going to have a good laugh at the expense of everyone who thought I was a fool to enter my nice little horse in such a big race. I'll enjoy it as much as Birbal enjoyed humiliating Mullah do Piazza." What? Haven't I told you that story before? Mullah do Piazza was one of the hakims, meaning Unani physicians, in Akbar's court. Do Piazza means 2 onions. What were his 2 onions? His testicles? Probably. Like most of his fellow courtiers, Mullah do Piazza hated Birbal with a passion, and was always looking for ways to show him up. One day he had a brainwave. He enlisted one of Akbar's concubines, promising her that the emperor would start to pay her more attention if she would cooperate. An agonized screech filled the air on the appointed morning, as Akbar conducted business in his court. There was a thoroughgoing commotion as two servants carried in the concubine, who had swooned. "She's been bitten by a snake, your Majesty," they shouted. "She's dying. What can we do?" Sure enough, there on her arm were two puncture wounds which looked suspiciously like those were made by a snake. The Emperor's heart was overcome with compassion. He cried out, "Can no one save her?" Up sprang Mullah do Piazza, who yelped, "Fear not, your Majesty, I am here." Then he grabbed the concubine's arm and began to suck the poison out of the bite, making a melodramatic pause now and again for effect. When he was finished, he told Akbar, "I think she is out of danger now, my liege." "Thank you, oh thank you, Mullah Sahib," exclaimed the relieved emperor. "You will be richly rewarded for your gallant services." Then he turned to Birbal and said, "Thank goodness Mullah Sahib was here. You were of no help at all." Birbal was nobody's fool. He had already figured out what was going on. That taunt hardened his heart against the mullah. He pondered his revenge carefully and patiently awaited a fit moment to carry it out. That moment came on the Emperor's next hunting expedition. After a hot afternoon of riding down game, Birbal signaled to Akbar that he needed to empty his bladder. After dismounting and assuming the stance, he promptly began to shout, "Oh, I'm dead! I'm a dead man now!" Akbar shouted back, "What's the matter?" In obvious pain, Birbal whimpered, "Your Majesty, while I was making water, a snake bit me on my member. Now I'm done for." Akbar looked around him, spied the mullah and said, "Mullah do Piazza, you saved the life of my concubine by sucking the poison out of her arm. You must do the same for Birbal. He is my most trusted companion. I can't do without him." The mullah tried to make some lame excuse, but the emperor would have none of it. Seeing that there was no alternative, and knowing that Birbal had got the best of him, Mullah do Piazza got down off his horse. He walked over to Birbal, bent down in front of him, and went to work. As the mullah kissed Birbal's penis in submission, Birbal whispered to him, "So, my child, are you enjoying this little drama now as much as you enjoyed the act you arranged in the palace?" All in the room enjoyed a good horse laugh over that one, and after I had calmed down, I asked, "So, are you so sure of your four-legged child that you are now ready to predict success?" "Almost, but not quite. Let us see after his spurt tomorrow." The spurt, which was the sort of little 1/2 to 3/4 pace gallop over 3 furlongs that gets administered as a lung opener to a racer 3 days before his race, went off well, for Redstone was as fit and well strung as a fiddle. Though Vimalananda still refused to speak definitely, he did begin to relax, as if the race was already over and his boy had done a good job. It being a terms race, there was no handicap to anguish over, and on the eve of the race there was little left to do at the stables except to sit watching Nakodaji, the ever-smiling Rajasthani farrier, shoeing the next day's runners as the other horses walked their perpetual circles around the stable buildings. A few horses need to wear steel horseshoes on an outing, but most horses get shod just before a race in aluminum racing plates that are much lighter and thinner than the steel shoes they require for daily wear and work. After the race, the farrier routinely changes the aluminum shoes back to steel. Nakodaji's intermittent hammering punctuated the persiflage that Temul and Dr. Kulkarni were exchanging over tea as they studiously attempted to avoid extra speculation over the outcome of the race. Only 3 other runners were left in it. Everyone else is afraid of the jinx, claimed the loquacious Dr. Kulkarni. And everyone wondered whether the meager field would hamper or enhance our boys' chances. When Redstone's jockey Chirag arrived to formally discuss strategy, he was admonished to run a conservative race by keeping Redstone second behind the horse, setting the pace. If the pace was too slow for Redstone, Chirag should take him to the front, but only far enough to have a clear passage at the bend. Chirag nodded his agreement and left to meet the trainers of his other mounts. We departed only when no one remained to talk with. Back at home, we spent the rest of the evening in a last perusal of the records of the 4 runners, trying to determine which would be the best able to carry 57 kilos over the 9 furlongs, which is 1,800 meters, of the Colonel Pratap Singh Cup. We went to bed early, and after a good sleep, a good breakfast, and a light lunch, we proceeded with due temerity toward the racecourse, eyes open to omens. My first meeting with Vimalananda had taken place on the day that his mare Elan won her first race for him. Vimalananda had gone on to become the most important influence in my life. I regarded that initial win as a particularly good portent for me. The interest in omens that had been awakened in me by the crash of the monkey's fist into Arzu's mirror intensified unexpectedly one afternoon during 1979 or 1980, on the eve of a race in which Vimalananda had a runner. Vimalananda and I were sitting peaceably in Temul's yard at the Bombay racing stables, mulling over the morrow, when our gaze turned to a gang of crows who traced a sinister circle around something on the ground about 15 or 20 meters away. Suddenly, Vimalananda jumped up and yelled, "Quick, Robbie! Go scare off those crows!" Vimalananda believed emphatically in feeding crows, and daily left food for them outside his Bombay kitchen window. One particularly hook-nosed crow became friendly and confident enough to eat from the palms of our hands, and feeding him became one of my Bombay joyances. For Vimalananda to request me to disturb crows was thus uncharacteristic enough to snap me to attention. When I rushed over to shoo the birds away, I found that they had been harassing a dying lizard. Vimalananda moseyed up behind and stared at the lizard for a compassionate moment before he turned to me and said gloomily, "Well, my boy, our mare will finish in the money tomorrow, but now I don't believe that the old girl can win. If only we'd noticed this sooner and actually saved the lizard, we'd have been guaranteed of victory." As he predicted, the mare did indeed place the next afternoon. The sight of such a sign before Redstone's big race would have winced us up into heaven of confidence, but we saw nothing out of the ordinary that day, neither on our way to the track nor as we walked to the stands. The first few races went by uneventfully, though Das Baba had come near to grovelling for another chance to appear there in person. Neither of us had wanted to have to deal with him, so he had to send his list of choices of uncertain value. I was not surprised that none of his picks before the big race came true. While I noted that he had selected Redstone as the winner of that race, he must have known that it would have been suicidal for him to do otherwise. Now Vimalananda rose and repaired for the paddock. I stood at the paddock's edge, eyeing the 4 horses as they filed in. Before security had become so tight, I would sometimes flash my badge and go backstage to watch the trainer and grooms perform the saddling ritual and administer final touches, like the tweaking of a forelock to make it lie straight. I saw that scene now in my mind's eye as the 4 runners, 2 with braided manes, began to parade around their owners and trainers, who stood in their business suits, tense with expectancy, giving last-minute cautions to the jockeys in their silks and white breeches. Vimalananda had taught me how to tell something of a horse's fitness by the sight of his muscles, and it was clear to me that by that criterion ours was the fittest in this field. Everything went smoothly as the horses came into the paddock center to be mounted by their riders, and then filed out to head for the track. Diverse criteria for success flitted through my mind as I tried to evaluate our prospects. One indicator of failure, which I had found to be reliable in 7 or 8 cases out of 10, was to see a horse drop dung while paragliding in the paddock, or walking to the starting gate. That Redstone's bowels did not move in either locale removed one worry from my list. As the horses wended their way to the gate, I pondered the other things that might go wrong. Sometimes a horse who dumped his rider and got loose on his way to the post would gallop away half his energy before he could be caught and remounted. Sometimes one fractious horse would kick another as they were being loaded into the starting gates. Sometimes one horse would take so long to be loaded that the others who were already in the starting gates would become fractious themselves. Sometimes a horse would bolt early from the gates again and again, producing a string of false starts that could dishearten other horses and distract their riders. Horses sometimes got left at the start, and some horses just unaccountably got spooked, or went sour, or hunkered down in obstinacy and refused at the last minute to race. After what seemed manifold eternities, all the horses were loaded. I, at least, had to concentrate on slowing my breath as my excitement tightened its squeeze on me. Just then, at what was the very last moments, as the starter lifted his flag and Vimalananda and I prepared to stand to watch the gates open, up popped the ferret-faced waiter, whose palm was always open for a tip, bringing us 2 cups of steaming tea. My heart teetered on the brink for a moment, and then sank down into my dress shoes. Tea with milk? Milk, the harbinger no augur wishes to see. Was this last-minute omen going to negate all my work at buleshwar? As I bent down to whisper to Vimalananda, "Does tea signify what milk does?" the flag dropped without warning, and the race began. I shoved my forebodings to the rear of my mind as I whipped up my binoculars and watched Redstone get a good jump out of the gate. It was Saturday, September 18, 1982. All horse owners are captivated as a race kicks off by a seductive moment or two in which they begin to taste the attainment of their long cultivated expectancies. Disappointments, recriminations, and prolonged autopsies of what actually happened and what might have been await all but one of them at the finish line. But at that moment, at the start, the owner's heart and horse leaped together. Though I was but a lowly racing agent, that alluring feeling and I were familiars, and I think both I and my owner held our breaths for the first few furlongs of the big race, and relaxed into respiration only when we saw that all was going well. The track had some give in it after a recent watering. Some observers later commented that it might have been a bit overwatered, and that there should have been false rails. Redstone was second coming out of the gate, and stayed there as the field passed the first few distance poles. 2 furlongs, 4, then 6. We could see that Redstone was handy, and that his competition was still more or less even with him. Everything was happening according to plan, but I continued to think contingencies. What if the jockey fell off? Race jockeys ride above their saddles, enhancing their speed by leaning forward with their weight above their mount's shoulders, even though this pose increases the likelihood of a fall. But no fall occurred. As the sound of thunder of horses' hooves began to catch up with the vision of their movement, we saw them approaching the bend, and began to urge jockey and horse on with our screams. The straight is very short in Pune, and when we saw Chirag take a good turn and then start to quicken his mount, it suddenly became clear to both of us that he was going to win. Now a bellow mounted from the racing public to mingle with ours as Redstone flashed past us to cross the winning post, a length and a half clear of his nearest rival. The third horse was 2 lengths further away, and the best pedigreed horse of the day a bad 4th. As Chirag sat back in his saddle and began to slow his mount, we stopped shouting long enough to think the same thought. Redstone, our nice little horse, had done it. I momentarily took back all the nasty things I had thought about Kumar when he leaned over to congratulate us. Mudhol Maharaj was beside himself with fervid glee. Our nearest neighbors wished us well, but most of the other racing patrons glared at us sourly from their boxes, sure that we plebeians had no business winning major races. We ignored these costive disapprovers as we strode down the steps to where the beaming Temul stood. Some owners became temporarily mute or manic when their horses win, but Vimalananda was a model of evenness and self-possession as he responded to the acclaim of his friends and well-wishers until Redstone arrived. When the whole group started back to the paddock, my shrieks of praise fused with those of the partisan crowd to roll billow-like above all the heads, and then it was over. Then all the trainers and owners and bettors and bookies who had something riding on this race that they had lost let their shoulders sag definitively as they sighed over their fates and began to concoct the excuses that would soon be demanded of them. I strode back to the paddock rail, where I saw Temul's ferment express itself in his post-race duties. The supervision of the undoing of the saddle's girth buckles, the inspection of the legs, the fond pat on the nose. Though this might have merely been a classic tune-up race, Temul had not yet won any classics, which made this win a good omen for him as well. After the white ball was raised to signify that no objections had been made, the results were confirmed and the photos were snapped as the stewards presented the cup. We then remounted grandstands, that for the rest of the day's races, only one of which, Das Baba's choice one, remained a Twitter at Redstone Celebrity. After the last race and the obligatory stop at the stables to distribute tips and feed treats to our hero of the day, we retired to the hotel for congratulatory scotch, an assiduously preserved bottle of black dog, and for the first of many retellings of the story of Redstone's brilliant run. A few days later, the race video arrived, and over the next week we must have relived the race visually at least a dozen times, watching Redstone's action, noting Chirag's technique, trying to divine how our nice little horse might fare against stiffer competition. The pundits were sure it was a fluke. One Turf Weekly dubbed Redstone the best horse of the day, but sniffed, "He is certainly not of the super class," and lamented that for the second year in a row the Colonel Pratap Singh Cup had been lifted by an outsider. Superclass or not, our horse had won, a fact which now lured me into what became a maelstrom of omenological fantasies. Though the events that led up to the big race had been filled with all sorts of contradictory presentiments, which seemed almost to nullify one another, the revelation that hot tea presaged an entirely different outcome from milk began to exercise my mind. Vimalananda, like Carlos Castaneda's Don Juan, looked to omens as agreement from the world, clues of nature's approval or disapproval of proposed human action, and he shared his knowledge of these generously. Useful tokens are often simple. To see milk being brought toward you is usually inauspicious, while water or yogurt brought toward you is normally auspicious. To see a sadhu walking toward you suggests a reduction in prosperity, with a shaved head, Jain sadhu, or a Jain nun being a strong sign of likely loss, while seeing meat, fish, or a corpse being carried toward you is a strong sign of impending gain. Most any event can presage something or another, but as I was soon to discover, one event becomes a herald for the future only when your attention has consolidated around a specific question that requires resolution from nature. Omenology bounded squarely to the fore of my consciousness during the very next week, as Vimalananda and I were travelling together by shared taxi from Pune to Bombay. When Vimalananda declined to drive to Pune, we would usually travel by taxi. Though the taxis normally carry 4 passengers, he and I would often pay for all 4 seats that we might enjoy privacy during the 3.5 to 4 hour ride. When we reached the taxi stand that evening, and there were no other potential passengers, we sat in the taxi at the head of the queue and prepared to depart. Just then, a harried-looking man, clutching a briefcase, rushed up and begged permission to take the front seat. We had no objection, and since it would save us a little money, we invited him in. As we drove away, the taxi driver announced self-importantly, "We will stop for 15 minutes each in Lonavala and Kopoli." "You are only supposed to stop in one or the other place, and for half an hour," remonstrated the man in the front seat with nervous promptness. "I know the rules," responded the taxi driver severely. "The rules say stops may be had in both places, and that is how it will be. If you don't like it, please take the next cab." This shut the man up so abruptly that we were drawn to observe him. He was a singularly unimpressive specimen of humanity, and a peculiar combination of anxiety, preoccupation, distrust, and cupidity which oozed from every pore of his blowsy visage, had transformed his natural lack of comeliness into a positively ill-favoured mien. Suspicion arose in two minds as one. As we in the back seat began to question his identity and his reasons for clasping his attached case to his bosom, as if his whole future were contained therein. When we stopped, as the driver had promised at Lonavala, the front seat man hopped out and promptly disappeared, to reappear only after half an hour. The rest of us were annoyed, but said nothing. At Kopoli, after the driver ostentatiously announced 15 minutes, the front seat man disappeared yet again, and when 25 minutes had gone by without a sign from him, the driver came to the table at which Vimalananda and I sat, post-snack. He said, "I can't continue to wait around for this fellow. I'll give him 5 more minutes. If he doesn't show his face by then, I'm going to go on to Bombay, and he can come by the next cab. If we leave now, will you bear witness of his shenanigans for me at the taxi stand, so that I don't get into any trouble?" As neither Vimalananda nor I were averse to giving this oaf a jolt, we readily agreed to this plan. After requesting the people at the restaurant to inform the man that we had left, we sped off, the man's briefcase lying untouched on the front seat. "I knew there would be trouble with this man as soon as I saw him," said the driver, in a beautiful Urdu of the refined North Indian city of Lucknow, "which is why I didn't want to take him with us. When his face did not please me, how was he able to even sit in my cab?" "Aha," I said. As a student of physiognomy, I knew exactly what he meant. Something was obviously improper about the man, something that violated the canons of auspiciousness, an unsuitable something that should have alerted us to the likelihood of trouble with him. Nature had somehow limned this inappropriateness onto his face, and had we heeded this message of his facial language, we could have spared ourselves his company. Had we done that, though, we would have missed sampling the feast of our taxi driver in full extemporaneous flight. By turns self-congratulatory, fearful, indignant, and overconfident, his monologue entertained us all the way to the Bombay taxi stand, where he was so pleased with our witness for him that he insisted on buying us pan and cigarettes as treats. We learned that when the front seat man had discovered that we had departed with his briefcase, he first clawed at his heart as if it might stop beating. Then, after regaining his composure, he had phoned Bombay in a frenzy to tell the taxi dispatcher to hold his briefcase as soon as it arrived. We three agreed that something illegal must be involved, which made it even less comprehensible. Why would he leave his briefcase unattended in the taxi while he gallivanted about? Struck by the momentous nature of this affair, I was soon seeing so many omens that was so thoroughly empty of significance that Vimalananda felt obliged to warn me not to get so worked up over divination by Auspicious. His warning came in the form of a story. One day, when Akbar woke early, the first person he saw was a one-eyed dhobi, which is a washerman, scrubbing clothes in the Yamuna. While he was wondering what kind of omen this was, the washerman happened to look up and bowed when he saw the emperor. Later in the day, Akbar tripped on the steps of his palace and bumped his shin. A bee stung him in the garden. The empress was taken ill, and there was a fire in the kitchen which delayed his lunch. "An ill-omened day," bawled the yes-men. Who did you see first thing this morning, your majesty?" "I saw the one-eyed washerman." "His face is inauspicious. Put him to death," they squealed. Out went a posse of soldiers to arrest the hapless washerman. Birbal, who had heard this entire exchange, took the man aside to give him a piece of advice as he stood trembling in the court, waiting for the emperor to appear and pass sentence. After Akbar arrived and told the washerman how unlucky his face was, the man replied humbly, "Begging your pardon, my lord, but I must ask you whose face is really more unlucky, mine or yours?" All the courtiers were aghast at the man's impertinence, but Akbar gestured them into silence. He said, "What precisely do you mean by that?" "Well, my liege, yours was the first face I saw this morning, and now I'm about to lose my head." Akbar laughed in spite of his attempt to remain solemn, and asked the man, "Who put these words into your mouth?" "Why, Birbal did, my lord." "Well, my good man, Birbal has saved you," said the emperor, as he ordered that the washerman be rewarded for his trouble. Was Akbar really about to have the man executed for being unlucky? Probably not, but you can never tell with kings, yogis, fire and water. Having gleaned from this that being mesmerized by signs and portents can easily deteriorate into karma-creating superstition, I again turned my spare neurons to racing, which had by now shifted back to Bombay. Our reappearance at the Mahalakshmi racecourse in the fall of 1982 was a festive occasion. Led by Kama and the Godrejis, the residents of our home bench greeted Vimalananda heartily and demanded a strike-by-strike account of the famous victory. Galubhai also showed up to offer his felicitations. He continued to come listen to Vimalananda's talks in the evenings, but though we also ran into him now and again at the track, he and his numerological charts sat elsewhere. It might have been a shame over his refusal to take Vimalananda's advice, or maybe he was simply determined to prove Vimalananda wrong. Vimalananda's newfound enthusiasm for life got an extra shot in the arm, while the erstwhile Maharaja of an erstwhile state on the Kaitarwar peninsula of Gujarat flew out to one of his palaces to discuss the making of a film there. We and the film's provisional producer were treated to a concert by the Maharaja's court musicians, a poetry reading by his court poet, and gourmet food cooked up by 2 Parsis trained chefs, served at the Maharaja's usual dinner time of 2 a.m. During this junket, I got the opportunity to boat over to the small island on which Vimalananda's ancestor Segal Shah had lived 15 generations earlier. There I saw the very mortar and pestle in which Segal Shah's wife had mashed the brains of their son Chalaya during the famous incident when Lord Shiva came to the couple in the form of a cannibalistic Aghori to test their devotion. Back in Bombay, Vimalananda began to contemplate some of his old projects that he was now ebullient enough to think of reviving. His most important project, however, continued to misfire, for after his strenuous race, Redstone seemed to be taking longer than normal to recapture his peak of fitness. An exhausting race can take everything out of a horse. We didn't want to wreck Redstone by racing before he had recuperated fully. Even worse would have been to have him break down during a race and have to be put down there and then. It happened from time to time. I still vividly remember the day that a horse dislocated his fetlock right in front of me as I stood at the rail watching his race. I was paralyzed with horror as his entire hoof and the joint above it came loose from his leg and began to flop, now against the front of his shin and now against its back. As he continued to gallop insanely down the track, articulating naked leg bone instead of metal-shod hoof against its grass. I could barely breathe from emphatic pain as I watched the club's vet rushing over to where he finally fell, and it seemed to take ages for the captive bolt of the vet's pistol to finally release him. For that to happen to a horse we knew and loved was so unthinkable that though we were loath to do so, we scratched Redstone's name from the list of runners for the Indian 2000 Guineas, the first of the season's classic races. We hoped that rest would enable him to resume form well before the deadline for acceptances for the Indian Derby, for soon a decision would need to be made on whether or not to run Redstone in the most prestigious of races. There is only one derby in a horse's career, and too few horses with classic potential in an owner's lifetime to turn down a chance, however slim, to tote home a derby trophy. But as the derby deadline neared, Vimalananda seemed to relax into a more philosophical frame of mind. A morning or two before the die had to be cast, I sat listening to him sing Avo Nagare Mor Hari, a truly angelic song that invites Krishna to abide within the singer. At the tune's conclusion, he put aside his harmonium and told me a story that I had heard many times before. Sudama was a Brahmana who had been Lord Krishna's Guru Bhai, meaning fellow disciple. Both were disciples of Sandipani Rishi. One day, when they were sent out to search for fuel for their guru's Homa fire, Sandipani's wife packed a lunch for them both, but Sudama became so hungry that he ate up both portions while Krishna got nothing. Krishna, who was Purnatmaka, Purushottama, perfection personified, just laughed it off. But you cannot cheat God incarnate and hope to escape unscathed. Sudama's fortunes took a nosedive from that day forward, and he was soon cast into the direst poverty. Years passed for Sudama in hand-to-mouth kind of existence, until one day his wife heard talk of the glories of Dwaraka, where Krishna ruled as king. She immediately sat her husband down and told him to go straight away to Krishna and ask for financial help. Sudama was still embarrassed to see Krishna's face, a guilty conscience biting, and he could not even dream of asking a favor from someone he had cheated. He refused to go, but his wife had had it with being poor and would not take no for an answer. She said, "If Krishna is all-knowing, as you say he is, he will know our plight without you having to say anything of your own accord. He will offer you enough to tide us over." When he realized that there was no escape, Sudama told his wife that he could not go to his old friend empty-handed like a beggar. He needed to carry a present with him. The cupboard was absolutely bare, so she went out and begged 4 handfuls of flattened rice, which she tied in a cloth. Taking his present, Sudama left for Dwaraka with a heavy heart, wondering all the way what sort of face he would show to Krishna. When Sudama reached Dwaraka, he introduced himself as a co-disciple of Sandipani Rishi and was immediately taken to Krishna's splendid palace. Seeing him coming, Krishna jumped up and rushed out to embrace him. Krishna then seated him on his own cot, washed his feet, performed ritual worship of his guest, and fed him sumptuously. Then Krishna reminisced about life with Sandipani and asked Sudama about all that had happened to him after he finished his studies. All this time there was no mention of either Sudama's need for money. As the afternoon drew to a close, Sudama lost hope and decided to leave. As he was taking Krishna's leave, Krishna asked him, "Didn't your wife send some present for me?" Sudama had been so embarrassed at the meagreness of his gift that he had forgotten all about it. As Sudama drew the little cloth parcel from his clothing, Krishna himself grabbed hold of it and ate first one fistful and then a second. By eating those 2 fistfuls of rice, Krishna consumed all of Sudama's evil karmas from his past births and from his present birth. As he raised the 3rd fistful to his mouth to remove all evil karmas from Sudama's births to come, his wife Rukmini, who was the incarnation of Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, caught hold of his hand to prevent him from taking even more. She asked him, "What are you thinking, Lord? If you eat that 3rd handful, you will be giving me away to Sudama as his servant, and I am not prepared to agree to that." Then Krishna laughed, released the 3rd handful of rice, and said to Sudama, "Now you can leave." Sudama was so upset that Krishna had accepted his gift and offered nothing in return that he lost his temper and said to him, "Kripana," meaning miser, "I did not want to come to ask you for money. My wife put me up to it. At least you could have done something for her." And he walked off. He conveniently forgot that he was in the wrong, that he was the thief, not Krishna. All along the road back to his house, he rehearsed the excuses he would make to his wife for coming home empty-handed. But when he reached the village, he couldn't believe his eyes. His pathetic little hut was gone, and in its place was a fabulous mansion. When his wife came out to meet him, he almost didn't recognize her. She was so well dressed and looked so satisfied. Then he remembered the last thing he had said to his dear friend Krishna, the Krishna who had done all this for him. He remembered that his parting word to Krishna had been Kripana. Now that Sudama was surrounded by luxury, he lost all taste for the things of the world. He turned the mansion over to his wife for her to enjoy. He had a little hut built for himself nearby, where he spent most of his time, his mind totally engrossed in Krishna. "It's true, Robbie," said Vimalananda in conclusion. "It is true that when Krishna wants to bless someone, he takes away that person's money, fame, pleasure, and other worldly joys. Eventually, when the man has lost everything, and everyone he knows has deserted him, he has no alternative but to remember Krishna and get lost in his bewitching eyes." Why he was retelling me the story was not too clear to me. But as I watched Vimalananda stare at the illumined from behind transparency of Guru Maharaj that sat in front of his chair, an ill-defined ominousness skittered like a cloud onto my mind's horizon. I knew that Vimalananda revered his Guru Maharaj as Krishna incarnate. They used to wear saris and dance together for the love of Krishna. I also knew that Guru Maharaj was quite capable of disrupting lives to guarantee spiritual development. At that moment, a not quite formed thought flitted swiftly before my eyes. A thought had it been fully fledged, would have been. I wonder if Guru Maharaj has something up his sleeve.